So this is part 2 of my reaction to Ryan Was looking at the differences between Australian and American houses. I'll put the link for part 1 in the description for this video, so that if you are interested after you've watched this, you can go and watch the first part. Now, if you haven't seen the first part of this, I will just make a point that the person who made the original video is from the UK and has based her video purely and simply around houses in Sydney that she stayed at. So my comment that I made in the first video, and which certainly showed up in what she was saying, is that Australia is a big country. There are climate differences, there are socio-economic differences, and of course there are cultural differences. People come from all sorts of backgrounds. So you are going to see lots of different types of houses in Australia, and what she is saying is only representative of one small portion of Australian housing.
I just don't get it.
At the back of the houses, in Australia it's also common to have a veranda on the back of the house as well as the front. Or if you don't have a veranda, there's usually some kind of solid covering that shades the patio, whereas in the UK you would rarely have a covering over your patio. You'd try and get as much light and heat as possible.
As I mentioned in my previous video on this particular topic, you are not likely to see a huge number of houses with back verandas in Australia. It's not as popular as what she seems to think, and I do believe that she has in fact been staying in some more upmarket houses in the Sydney area. And I will also point out that you are probably more likely to see houses with back verandas in the more northern areas of Australia, where there is that need for more coverage around the windows and stuff. Most of the time in Australia there may be a bit of extra roofing over the back door area. You may get a bit of a extra roofing. There may be a path perhaps along the side of the house with a bit of an overhang, and that's about it really. People do like to put up awnings and stuff these days, and there is growing popularity with making backyards into extensions of your house, essentially, where you can have a barbecue and where you may have awnings and stuff, so you can have like an outdoor area where you can have barbecues or whatever. But it's not something that you are going to see in a great deal of houses in Australia. For the most part, like I said, you may see an additional bit of roofing over where the back door is, just to try and keep the weather out of the back door, because you want to keep the rain out, but not necessarily a lot of houses with verandas.
Conservatories also don't seem to exist in Australia, so this is basically an extension on the back of your house that's usually made of glass, and these are really common in the UK, but I don't think that would be possible in Australia with the heat.
It would like cook you. It would turn you into a human baked bean.
I've seen houses in Tasmania that were definitely upmarket houses, I'll put that out first, but that did have a conservatory. Because when you look at places like Tasmania and Victoria, then having somewhere where you can sit in the colder months and get a bit of sunlight in without being outside in the cold is actually something that is greatly appreciated. And while you may not see quite as many conservatories in Australia, what you will quite likely see in the cooler states in older houses is sunrooms. They're your little rooms that they're generally kind of not very big rooms, but they basically have windows all around, and they're there for in the cooler months for you to sit and take in a bit of the heat from the winter sunshine. And obviously you're not going to go there in summer a lot of the time, it's too hot, but yeah, it's definitely not something that is not unheard of in Australia. I'd imagine that you wouldn't particularly want it in the much warmer states like Queensland or Northern Territory or much of New South Wales. But certainly Victoria, Tasmania, mainly sunrooms, but yeah, there will be the occasional sort of country manor style house that has a conservatory.
Indeed.
Having a swimming pool in your back garden is obviously much
I don't know why this is kind of funny to me. It's like it looks like a meme to me, like swimming pools in Australia, swimming pools in the UK. That's pitiful. I'm sorry. You can't even put something in the side walls to keep them up?
Do you think she intentionally looked for the most pitiful looking temporary swimming pool that she could find and then said that's what you could find in the UK?
I do like the slide though. Anyway, this is beautiful. Whoever lives there, if one of you guys lives here with this freaking, what is this, hot tub with a waterfall into the pool? Oh my God.
much more common in Australia
awesome.
than it is in the UK. It's not as common as I thought it would be actually, although I would think going further north where it's hotter it's probably more common to have a swimming pool.
That would make sense.
So a few things in terms of swimming pools in Australia. First of all, that swimming pool on the left, once again going back to what I said about her most likely staying at more upmarket houses, because you're mostly going to see pools like that in the wealthier suburbs of Sydney and Brisbane and that. And in terms of her saying, well, I thought there'd be more pools than what there are in Australia. First of all, Sydney is not the tropical climate that you see further north. Sydney's still not in a super hot area, and she's obviously seen that. She's spoken out about it going down to 9 degrees in a house overnight. So she understands that Sydney has those cooler seasons when it's not super hot. So she must realise too that there is less of a need for pools in somewhere like Sydney because it does have the cooler months. But don't forget also that so many parts of Australia are so close to the coast. So if you're close to a beach area, then chances are you're going to be more than happy heading to the beach rather than just having a pool in your own backyard. That said, I'm pretty certain that if you were to go into Google Maps and have a look at the Brisbane area, you'd probably see some of the more affluent suburbs with lots and lots of backyard swimming pools. But as far as comparing the super fancy pool to the tatty looking pool on the UK, if you go into Kmart, Target or Big W in Australia, heading into summertime, there are so many of these pop-up backyard swimming pools that you can buy, and so many people will put in these temporary swimming pools for the season just to cool off. So not everyone has permanent swimming pools, and these ones like on the right hand side, while I'm sure most people are smart enough to put them up and not make them look totally ratty like that, you're still going to see plenty of these little smaller temporary pop-up swimming pools in Australia. So this is definitely quite a, I guess, deceptive notion that she's putting out there. I think too the other thing that she probably doesn't realise is that there are very, very strict regulations in terms of fencing around swimming pools in Australia. So these days, for someone to have a swimming pool is quite a costly venture. You have to have really good fencing that fences off the swimming pool and keeps it separate from any back door, so that no little kids can go in. It's got to have secure child-proof latches on any gates, and of course then you've got the cost of all the chemicals and everything for keeping it clean. And for people who don't enjoy going to the beach to swim, people who don't like the sand, in the areas that do get warmer weather, well, pretty much anywhere where you have a larger population, there's always going to be a huge selection of public swimming pools where people can go anyway.
The bathrooms in Australia are quite different to in the UK. So in the
Whoa.
UK you can't have plug sockets in your bathroom normally, and in
Right.
Australia you always have plug sockets. This is apparently due to some difference with the electrical systems in Australian houses. That means it's safe to have sockets in.
But I assume you guys have GFC outlets like we do here in America. It looks like a normal outlet, but it has buttons on it to reset. Like it'll trip that outlet alone. It won't trip the main breaker.
I think it would be a very deep, long rabbit hole to try and look into the differences between Australian power points and American power points and safety regulations, switches, etc. I have seen power points in Australia that do have a reset button in the centre, but of course for the most part most people usually have power boards that they run from their power points that have reset buttons. You don't tend to see power points with those reset buttons so much, and they're certainly a costly thing, and I think that goes down to the very strict regulations in Australia when it comes to electrical safety, because don't forget, in Australia we have much stronger outlets than in America. So obviously the safety regulations need to be really high. So I find it interesting that they do have those switches on American PowerPoints. I'm just wondering, is that only in PowerPoints in like bathrooms and stuff, or is that something that they now have in all PowerPoints?
Anyway, what is this I'm looking at? This switch here, is this common? Fan, heat, light. I've never seen anything like that. And I do not know what the heat one means. How does that work? What's it heating? Is it just heating the bathroom? That would actually be awesome.
I think there is a bit of this notion amongst many Americans that Australia is very, very backwards technologically. But we have some innovations in Australia that Americans don't have. And one of them is our IXL Tastics. So if you are not familiar with these, obviously if you're Australian you may well have one in your bathroom, or you probably know someone who has one in their bathroom, or you at least know what they are. But they're heating globes which are in the ceiling. It's a whole unit, so you have a light and you have heating globes and you have a fan all in one unit, and you have those 3 buttons. So you have the option of just turning on the light, or you can turn on the light with the fan and the heating globes. And trust me, when you live somewhere like Victoria or Tasmania, there is nothing more divine than climbing out of the shower on a really, really cold morning and having those wonderful IXL heating globes shining down on you and just giving you that warmth. It means it's not necessary to have a heater in the bathroom, and well, it's divine.
I've also never seen words printed on a switch, and I've never seen switches like this. Everything about that is kind of strange to me, but it does seem practical, because that way you would know what they do if you go over to somebody's house. Over here in the UK, they just have a string.
Bathrooms where it can get wet. Also, the light switches are different in Australia. So in the UK, in your bathroom, you always have a pull cord so that you don't have to touch a switch if you're wet. And in Australia, it's just a normal light switch. And they also nearly always have fans in the bathroom. So you'll have a switch with a light on, the fan on, and occasionally also a heat switch where you have heated light bulbs.
Why? What do the heated light bulbs do? What does that mean? I've never heard of that. What's a heated light bulb? Does that heat the room?
This is a strange little difference, but in Australia, the side of bathtubs are nearly always solid, so they're quite often tiled, whereas in the UK, you tend to have a plastic panel. And I remember an Australian friend saying that she went to Wales and found this really strange because she'd never seen that before.
Which part's plastic?
Australian friend saying they're quite often tiled, whereas in the UK, you tend to have a plastic panel.
I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. I think both of these look normal. It's just this one looks fancier here over on the left.
I remember an Australian friend saying that she went to Wales and found this really strange because she'd never seen that before.
It is a little bit different, but it's much of a muchness. I think, if you have tiles, you still have that open area behind the tiles. They will be on a sheet of waterproof board. Or you may, instead of tiles, use lamy panel, which is your laminated board, which is really not that far off from using plastic. I guess it comes down to plastic panels like that having to be the precise size, whereas if you're using tiles or lamy panel, you cut them to size.
Also, sinks in Australia, you nearly always have a cupboard underneath a sink in the bathroom, which we call a vanity. In the UK,
Same with
it's
America.
more common just to have a sink on a stand.
I actually find that really surprising, because when you take into account the fact that in the UK houses are smaller, wouldn't you want to have that cupboard space under the sink? You've got all that wasted space if you've just got a sink with nothing underneath it.
In Australia, they also have a few differences with household terminology. So what we'd call a sofa or a settee in the
Look
UK,
at this.
Australians would call a lounge. And what we'd call a lounge or a living room in the UK, Australians would call the lounge.
You call the sofa itself a lounge. That's very, I don't know, that's very fancy. I wouldn't have thought that out. I would have thought you guys called it a Sophie.
Sofa and lounge are pretty much interchangeable in Australia. A lot of people might call it the lounge, other people call it the sofa. And then you get people that will interchange. As far as the lounge and the lounge room, people also call the lounge room the living room sometimes. But we wouldn't say lounge because then there's confusion. People think you're talking about the lounge as in the sofa.
Let's go sit on the lounge.
Lounge room. Also, bedding and towels. In Australia, they call this Manchester, which is meant to be from the olden days when cotton items had to be imported from Manchester in the UK.
They had to be?
Yeah, nah. Mostly we call it bedding. And we call towels towels. Manchester is a term that you will probably hear in stores. They will refer to having a Manchester section, which is the whole global thing of this is where you're going to find your bedding, your towels, all that sort of linen stuff.
Manchester. Once again, that's very fancy and long for an Australian word. I would have thought it was, surely you guys have shortened this. Many? Manor? Get the manor.
Also, a duvet is called a doona in Australia. They do use the word quilt as well, though.
Okay, I've seen stores refer to doona covers as quilt covers. But in terms of doonas and quilts, in my eye, what I think of as being a quilt is in fact that extra thick blankety thing that goes on top of your bed. You don't put a doona cover on it. It's not the same as a doona. A quilt is a thicker thing that's filled with filling that goes on top of your bedding when it's really, really cold. As opposed to a doona, which, is also filled with filling, but it's not as heavy, and it has a doona cover, and it's more of your daily bedding.
A flat or apartment in Australia is called a unit.
Again, both are very much interchangeable, so you might call it a flat or you might call it a unit.
So in Australia,
Same here in America. That's like the official term, If they're actually if they're like, yep, they're in unit 3, yep, like go fix their water heater in unit 3.
you can sit on a lounge in the lounge room and then go and get under your Manchester and your doona.
Major misinterpretation there. You're never ever going to hear an Australian talking about going and snuggling underneath their Manchester. If someone said that, people would just look at them and be like, what the heck are you talking about? You might go and snuggle under your doona, but like I said, we don't refer to our bedding or our towels as Manchester, other than it being a Manchester department in a store. It's not something that you refer to at home. Thanks for listening. Once again, if you live in a different area of Australia from me and you have a different interpretation of the things that I've discussed in this video, I'd love to hear from you and hear how you see things where you come from. So, thanks for listening. Please hit the like button. Please subscribe if you haven't already done so. And leave a comment below.